Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I wanted to talk to you about how to assess training load in runners that you see in clinic. Now this can be a really confusing topic because there's lots of different options out there, lots of different measures that you could assess. But actually in this video we're going to talk about some simple strategies that you can use to help you monitor training load, which we know is really important in the development of running injury, but also to make sure training is at the right level to improve performance. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of really good studies today from Chris Napier and colleagues and also Max Paquette and colleagues, and I've included a link to those in the references for the video here. Also, we've got a link to our iliotibial band series, a great series of 3 different webinars that you can watch if you want to learn lots more about how to manage iliotibial band syndrome in runners. So click on that link, explore that, and you'll learn loads from those webinars, I'm sure. So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about training load and some of the terms that we need to become familiar with when we're talking about training load. It's important to start with to understand that there is an external training load and internal training load. And as you'll see through this video, we're going to highlight how it's important that we have a way to assess both. So let's talk about what those things are then. Now, external training load is the applied mechanical load. So we can measure this by looking at things like distance or duration of a run. And I think we're pretty good at testing these things. It's really common for us to track things like weekly mileage or duration of a session. But we need to add to that by including internal training load. And this is the physiological and psychological responses to this external load. So this can be RPE, which is rating of perceived exertion, heart rate, or things like blood lactate levels. So it's important to gather both of these when we're looking at training load. And we see that when we talk about some of the research here, that there are some limitations if we're only really measuring external load, which many people do. They just look at changes in things like mileage without really looking at the response to those changes. Now, some of the limitations we have here, and they talk about it in Max Paquette's research, they say one of the major limitations of measuring external training load is it fails to take into account for how runners feel during a given training session, which is not only influenced by external load of the training session, but also by the runner's state of recovery and daily stress. Now, this is really important, and when we're working with people, we start to see then how the psychosocial factors like stress and things may actually play a role in their response to training, and how important fatigue is. In Paquette et al. Study, they talk about some research that shows that actually running in a fatigue state is likely to increase tissue load. So if we're only really looking at the external load, we're just looking at mileage, we're not taking into account how recovered someone is, how fatigued they are, how stressed they are, which is all going to actually have an effect on the overall training load. Now, in Chris Napier and colleagues' work, they actually identify some limitations of one of the common ways we might track change in training load, which is looking at the 10% rule. So looking at training volume and suggesting that it increases by a maximum of 10% per week. Now this is okay. As a rule, it has its limitations, but one of the issues again is it's only really looking at external training load. It's just looking at how far someone's running. And they identified an issue with this. So in their research, they say, our results suggest that a 10% increase in training volume may not represent true week-to-week changes in training, and in fact, could be equivalent to much larger changes in training stress. And this is something that's come out of Chris Napier's work, and also the study we've talked about by Max Paquette, which is really good clinical commentary, that just looking at external training load measurements like distance tends to underestimate the training stress. And that's a key point I'd like to take away from this video. If we're only looking at mileage, we're underestimating the total training stress. So technically then, when we're looking at training load, and of course we've talked about that in the title of this video, we need to know what training load is. Now, training load then is the product of external and internal loads. So looking, yes, at things like duration and distance, but also response to that duration and distance. So a nice example here might be combining duration with session RPE. So perhaps multiplying the minutes of exercise in a session by the rating of perceived exertion score that someone's giving in that session. So if the session was 100 minutes and they've scored it a 4 out of 10, it's normally a score out of 10 that's given, that will give you 400 exercise units for that particular session. And this is quite a clever way then of taking into account both volume and intensity in monitoring training load, and is actually looking at training load including both external and internal training load tests. Now, session RPE is actually a really versatile way of assessing intensity and response to exercise. It does correlate with blood lactate levels, so other measures of internal load, and it doesn't require any kit. And I think for us as clinicians working with runners of different levels, actually having something that doesn't require a really accurate heart rate monitor or blood lactate testing or anything sophisticated like that can be really good. But what I would say on a practical level is it takes practice to use. So I would get people used to the 10-point scale, get them to practice with it for a little bit, get them used to what these different kind of levels on the scale feel like, and then they're going to get better, more accurate results as you continue to use it as part of your training load assessment. And that then is a recommendation that came out of Chris Napier's work. They said, we recommend the regular use of session RPE and training duration to monitor training load in runners. So it's actually potentially a really simple tactic that you can use in your runners to measure their overall training load. And I think one of the nice things about RPE is it tends to be quite responsive. If we're feeling run down, if we're feeling fatigued, if we're feeling stressed, that perception of exertion can increase. So it can give you an indication then that someone perhaps needs some recovery. If they're telling you that a session that previously felt a 2 or 3 on the scale is now 4 or 5, it's the same session, the same pace, but it seems like a lot more effort, you might want to look at whether they are a little bit fatigued, whether they need a bit more recovery, maybe they're very stressed, perhaps, and that's influencing their perception of effort here. Now, these things are useful then if we're looking at training load. As we said, we can include training volume, essentially how much, and training intensity to some degree by looking at RPE. But there are other parts of training load that we do need to try and monitor as well. Now, these would include training frequency, so how often you're training. And this can be particularly important in some pathologies. For example, tendinopathy seems to be more likely to be aggravated if people are training consecutive days. So higher frequency training may be more challenging because it doesn't give the tendon a chance to recover. The surface is going to influence the stress that's placed on the tissues. So we need to find out, are they doing most of their training on softer surfaces like grass or sand, which actually, oddly enough, are thought to increase the stress on things like the Achilles? Or are they doing lots more running on harder surfaces, stiffer surfaces like tarmac and road? We want to know as well about the training type. Is it looking at hill running, for example, which is going to have quite different stresses on the body to running on the flat or running on a track or a camber? So getting to know the deeper details in someone's training is important. And as ever, it's tying it back to that individual, their presentation, and why it's important for them, and thinking through, why does running in this particular way or maybe on this particular surface lead to their symptoms? So an example there might be if you've got a sudden increase in hill running in someone with a proximal hamstring tendon pain. We know that as you run uphill, you tend to flex the hip more. You tend to also probably work the hamstring a bit harder as it helps glute max to drive you up the hill. So it would make sense if they've got an increase in hill running, that may be a piece of the puzzle in why they've gone on to develop hamstring tendon pain. And then as part of our management, we might recommend reducing that hill running or just running on the flat for a little while until symptoms settle. So it's always worth coming back to the individual and why it's relevant to them. It's also important to make sure we're tracking change in training, not just looking at the current situation, but I'd go back and look over at least the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks in their training to look for changes in volume, intensity, training type, surface, etc. Because there's also some research that shows there might be a lag. You might actually see a change in training and it might be a couple of weeks before someone starts to develop symptoms in response to that. So it can be useful to go back that a little bit further. Final point to add today, if we've looked at training volume and intensity, we've got measures of external and internal training load, and we're combining them together to get a good idea of the training load. It's also very important to make sure we look at the recovery strategies in there as well, because it's the recovery that really allows us to adapt to that training load. And without that recovery, we're more likely to see fatigue creep in, and we're going to see impairments in performance and potentially the development of injury. So have a look, see, have they got recovery days planned in their schedule? Have they got recovery weeks planned in as part of their training as well? What's their training structure like? Are they trying to do a really tough session the day after their longest run? Could they move things around a bit to get the most out of their training? And what are their recovery strategies like sleep like? Are they sleeping well? Are they getting good quality sleep and waking up well recovered? And there's actually some simple scales out there, like fatigue rating scales, that you can use with people as a way, again, another internal load measurement essentially, because you're looking at their response to training. And of course, we need to act on what we see, and we need to talk to the runner to help them understand. So if their fatigue levels are really high, if their session RPE scores are starting to climb up when you might not expect them to, if you're starting to see aches and pains and niggles or impairment in performance, these are all signs that where they may actually need to focus more on recovery, bring their training down to a manageable level, really focus on good quality sleep to allow them to recover better and then come back and build their training again afterwards. Okay, thanks everyone for listening. I hope this has given you a nice, useful overview of training load and some of the factors that we might look at. We talk about it in a lot more detail in Running Repairs Online, including delving into training structure in more detail, having a look at some of the evidence behind it, some of the practical recommendations, particularly with return to running. But I thought I'd give you a nice overview and include some of the recent papers. So if you have any questions about what we've talked about here, please do put them in the comments. If there's anything you'd like us to talk about on these videos, as I say, they are for you. Let us know. Perhaps there's a particular pathology you'd like us to discuss. You could even let us know about a runner you're struggling with at the moment. Perhaps we could come up with some suggestions in the video to help you with that. And if you want to learn more about running injury, don't forget we've got the link to that free ITBS webinar series. You can check that out. Okay, thanks everyone for listening. Bye for now.